Quick, it was not mentioned in the announcements, but if you are a guest or a visitor here this morning, we'd appreciate it if you could fill out one of these little contact cards. This is just a helpful way for us to get a hold of you in the event that we have to. Sometimes, because we meet in a school, they move our worship services or they have to cancel them. And so this is a way, your contact information allows us to be able to communicate that with you so you don't show up on a Sunday and we're not here. So it's rare, but it does happen. So if you could fill that out and you can put it in one of the wooden boxes in the back, we'd really appreciate that. So, okay. So today we are going to be in the book of Exodus, and we're actually going to be we're going to be in the book of Exodus today, and we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. We're going to focus our time on that. But today we're going to look at verses 1 through 7 to kind of give a bit of a context for what the next few weeks will look like moving ahead. I've asked Jeff Coyle to read for us. So, Jeff, if you want to come up, and is this good? Drew, you want him to move over a little? Okay. So Jeff is going to read Exodus 34, verses 1 through 7.
The Lord said to Moses, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or be seen anywhere on the mountain, not even the flocks and herds may graze in front of the mountain." So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up to Mount Sinai early in the morning as the Lord had commanded him. And he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation.
Thank you, Jeff. So for the next few weeks, friends, we are going to go through a series that we're going to call The Character of God. And the character of God is going to focus on Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. The primary focus each week will be looking at 5 words that God uses to describe himself: compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, and abounding in faithfulness. So each week we will take a look at one of those words that God uses to describe himself, and we'll kind of unpack it and get a better understanding of it. This week, what I wanted to do is actually address verse 7. Because if you were listening, paying attention, you heard that verse 6, these really warm and comforting words about God: compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, abounding in faithfulness. These are really comforting words. Forgiving. And then verse 7 hits. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He will punish the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. If you were listening, paying attention, there is tension there. There is some tension between how God describes himself in these warm and comforting words and also some words of judgment and justice. And so that tension exists in this passage, and that tension has existed in this passage for thousands of years. And what I want to do is sort of help us live into that tension, lean into it, but also see that it's a necessary thing for God to have the graciousness and the compassion, but also have the need to enact a level of justice. It's a necessity for God. And so the big idea that I want us to walk away with today is that Exodus 34 6 and 7 tells us about God's generous love and the lengths he will go to restore our broken world. We're going to set the table by looking at how did we get to this point in the story. And then from there, we'll sort of really dive into the tension aspect of this. We see God in these verses. We see Jesus very much in these verses. And wonderfully enough, this ties right into communion. This will be just as much we're setting the table now, we will all gather around the table at the end to celebrate communion. So, with that being our big idea, let's set the table this morning with our time. So, the story of Moses, Israel, and the Exodus. Prior to this passage, Israel had been enslaved by Egypt. They worked for Egypt for free for hundreds of years. God, in his mercy, heard their cry for help and freed them. And Moses is the leader of Israel as they leave Egypt and they go into the Exodus, as they are heading towards the promised land. Moses, in addition to being a leader, he is also the mediator. And what we mean by mediator is that he is sort of the go-between between Israel as a large group of people and God. He is this in-between, this liaison, this individual who will help communicate from God to the people and the people to God. And Moses does this a number of different times throughout the book of Exodus. One of the really strong ways we see it, or a very vivid way we see it, is actually when Moses goes up Mount Sinai. This is where we're actually getting our story now, is that Moses heads up Mount Sinai, and he spends 40 days and 40 nights at the top of a mountain that is covered with this sort of dark cloud. That dark cloud is God's presence. And as the mediator, Moses is going to spend time with God so that God can speak to him, and then Moses goes down to speak to Israel, to God's people. During those 40 days and 40 nights, Moses receives God's words, or the 10 Commandments, as we kind of commonly refer to them today. As Moses takes these 10 Commandments and begins making his way down to Israel to share with the people this new promise that God has made to them, and that within this promise are these set of rules and laws that they sort of have to maintain and keep in order for God to continue to bless them and protect them. As Moses is making his way down Mount Sinai to share this with his people, he encounters a pretty tragic and shocking thing, which is a statue of a statue of gold in the shape of a calf. And Israel is worshiping this calf. And this golden calf breaks the very first rule, the very first commandment, at the very top of the list. Do not worship any other gods or have any other gods before me. Israel has already broken it. Moses isn't even all the way down the mountain and he sees this. God sees this. And God is left with a question. What am I going to do in response to this? So I want to pause here because I kind of want this to sink in for us. God has just rescued his people from Egyptian slavery after hundreds of years, has guided them and walked them through the wilderness, through a desert, has brought them right to the promised land, has provided for them throughout the whole journey, has kept his promise, and now makes a new promise with Moses and his people. And all they have to do is kind of keep these 10 rules. All they have to do is just honor God and respect him and show their appreciation and love for him. And they aren't there that long, 40 days, and they're already falling backwards. They're already sliding back into their old habits, their bad habits. God has, we could argue, God has every right to say, you know what? I'm done with this. I am tired of dealing with you. Maybe that's a bit harsh and strong, but he does. Though he makes a promise, God doesn't have to keep it, but he does. Even though the promise on the other side, on Israel's side, although they don't hold up their end of the bargain, God maintains to keep that promise, and yet he continues to do it. So now, the mediator, who is Moses, now has to become the intercessor. An intercessor is similar to a mediator, a go-between, an in-between, so between Israel and God. Moses stands between to be the kind of this communicator. But as an intercessor, Moses pleads with God to not punish Israel, but to be patient with them. And so Moses actually goes back up the mountain. He goes back up the mountain to plead with God. God, I get it. I know you're mad. I know you're frustrated. But don't punish us. Please, just be patient with us. This is a foreshadowing. This is actually a picture of God's future relationship with his people. Is God keeping his promise and looking after his people, the people holding to their end of the promise, and then eventually falling back on it, and then someone stepping in to be the intercessor, to plead with God, to ask God to be patient. This will be a narrative, a story that is woven throughout the Bible. This is now where we get to verses 6 and 7. This is kind of where the focal point is. This is where the tension actually begins. So verse 6 reads, the Lord. Now, this is God speaking. This is the first, this is kind of a unique thing I learned about it this week. This verse, verses 6 and 7 in Exodus, is the most referenced and cross-referenced passage in the Old Testament. This would be the Old Testament version of John 3:16. That roughly 30 or more times, these words, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. That phrase is used over 30 times in the Old Testament. Now, the words sometimes get moved around a little bit, but it is the way in which God is described to his people. What's different about this time is God is actually the one doing the describing. So this is the first time in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, where God actually describes himself. Up until this point, there have been other ways that God has been described and portrayed through the authors. This is the first time where God himself says, this is my character. This is who I am. And he actually attaches his name to it, Lord or Yahweh, his personal name. And so he says, me, myself, God, I am compassionate and gracious God. I am slow to anger. I'm abounding in love and faithfulness. I will maintain love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. These are really comforting words for Moses to hear, because Moses hears these when he's at the top of Mount Sinai for the second time. God speaks these words to him. And I would imagine that Moses, he hears this first start and he thinks, so God heard my plea. God, he's going to be patient with us. God would continue and says, yet. Yet could be a bit of a scary word for Moses now, because what is the following statement? God says, yet, God does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. If you're ever doing any sort of writing, or in this case, speaking, you always want your last sentence or your last phrase to be the thing that people remember. If we're Moses And God says, the last thing he says to us on the top of Mount Sinai is, I do not leave the guilty unpunished, and I'm going to punish the children and their children, the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. That is not comforting to hear as you're heading back down the mountain. That is uncomfortable. That's the tension that we talk about in this passage. Moses feels it most likely. The biblical authors throughout the Old Testament felt it. Israel felt it in their retellings of this story. And I'd argue we should feel it too a little bit, because it should make us feel a little uncomfortable. Because we do believe in a God that is gracious and compassionate and that is kind. And what we want him to be is sort of end it right there at verse 6 and not talk about the punishment side of things. We don't want to bring up the judgment side of things, because no one wants to be judged or punished. I'll be the first to admit that. But even within those words, God is still drawing our attention and the attention of Moses to the first things he said. So though God says, I will punish the guilty, and I will punish the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generations. Now that term third and fourth generation sort of just means it's like any number. It doesn't mean exactly, it's just to a specific number. However, God says that in light of or in contrast to the first thing he says, which is that he's compassionate and gracious, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness. In other words, God says, my love, my compassion, my mercy, I will be liberal with it. It will be a waterfall. It will dwarf the punishment that still has to happen. And so though there will be hardships and challenges, and they'll be a bit painful, don't forget about my unfailing compassion and love for you that goes on forever. This term thousands is similar. It's in ancient Hebrew, it would be like infinity. It's never ending. This sort of large contrast of thousands to a few is actually a very key understanding for Moses and for us, and that's because if we're looking at the lower number and compared to this higher number, what we realize is that God at the end is still a compassionate God who sticks to his promise, who will continue to be gracious and generous and kind. But we can also find rest and comfort that justice will be enacted, that something has to be punished for the wrongs of the world. One of the authors that I was reading this past week said it well. They said, this is a clear statement, this laying out of these two different numbers in these verses. This is a clear statement that God's judgment is only a means to a greater end, which is his willingness to keep his promise, his ability to keep his promise. So if we fast forward now to the story of Jesus, we begin seeing Jesus embody these words of God that we find in Exodus. That God describes himself as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, abounding in faithfulness. Those are words that Jesus lives out throughout his life. That Jesus, throughout the Gospels, is compassionate and gracious. That he cares for the weak and the marginalized and those who are hurting, that he extends grace and mercy to those who need it. He's slow to anger. He spent years with these followers, specifically these 12 disciples who often didn't understand what he was talking about, often misunderstood what he was referring to or a story he was telling, and yet Jesus was patient with them and didn't get upset with him, that he was abounding in love and faithfulness, that is seen so clearly as he moves closer and closer to his arrest in his inevitable crucifixion. That his love for his friends, for this world, was so great he was willing to follow through and remain faithful to the call that God had placed on him. And that call then lives into verse 7. Because God has to punish sin. God has to punish wickedness. And so that tension still exists even up to the moment of Jesus. And we actually we can hear the story of what that tension looks like when Jesus is in the garden before he's arrested. That Jesus is overwhelmed with the anxiety and the tension of what's going to happen to him as he is arrested and crucified, that he struggles with it, he wrestles with it, that he even asks, is there another way that we can relieve this tension, God? Is there another way, Father, that we can make this happen? Can we skip verse 7 and just stick with verse 6? But it was a necessity. And so just like Moses was a mediator and an intercessor for Israel, Jesus becomes our mediator and our intercessor. That God could have punished us for our sin, for our wickedness, for our evil. That we were actually the ones who were meant to pay that. And Jesus stands in between us and God and says, put me in their place, punish me in their place. I'll take it for them. He pleads with God to do that. And God allows it to happen. Jesus really then becomes like a greater Moses to us. That as Jesus is put on the cross and punished in our place, justice is satisfied. Verse 7 gets wrapped up in a bow with a period on it. It doesn't have to be talked about anymore. We don't have to address it anymore because why? Because it is finally finished. That justice has finally been paid. That Christ's death on the cross will cover not just the sins of the parents and their parents to the third and fourth generations. It will cover that justice forever. It then equals out the mercy and graciousness that will extend to thousands and thousands and thousands. Justice is satisfied, mercy gets poured out on the cross, and then God will renew his promise once and for all. It's why we don't have a mediator anymore. It's why we don't have to go to someone to ask them to plead to God on our behalf. Jesus did it for us already. It's already been paid for. It's already been taken care of. We now get to reap the wonderful benefits of it. This is why communion becomes such an important part, not just today, but every time we get to celebrate it. Because it's a reminder of this. It's a reminder of Exodus 34, 6, and 7. It's a reminder of the story of Jesus. It is this time for us to remember that God was renewing his promise with Israel, and he was doing that through Moses and through a mediator and through an intercessor. And it's also our reminder that God's covenant is one that he will keep, because the covenant was one that he made with his own son on the cross. That's why Jesus would say when he sat there with his friends around the table during their last meal, when he takes the cup and he says, this cup represents my blood that will be for the new covenant that gets made with you. Jesus is referring to, in that moment, he's saying the covenant that we used to read about and hear about when we were growing up, the one that Moses made, that covenant, I get to make the new one. And this one is one that will extend for thousands and thousands of years. Communion. If I could just say it in a very kind of simplistic, blunt way. Communion is our reminder that God didn't give up. That God said, you know what? I am determined to get these people back in my arms. And I will do everything in my power to make that happen. He didn't give up on Israel when they were worshiping the golden calf. He didn't give up on the disciples when they turned their back on Jesus and rejected him. He's not going to give up on you for whatever mistakes or failures you've made either. That's what this meal reminds us of. It's a grace meal. It's the gift that God extends to you. And it's one that we get to celebrate. All right, conclusions and takeaways. I look forward to the weeks ahead when we don't have to talk so much about the tension, that we get to see Jesus and God in these compassionate and gracious ways. But I wanted to address this because I feel like it sets us up now well for the next 5 weeks. But the takeaway, and this will be it pretty much every week, is Exodus 34, 6 and 7 tells us about the generous love of God and how far that love will go. That's your takeaway. That's the one thing that I hope, if you leave with anything today, my friends, it is that. But some takeaways that I want us to leave us with. This is a story that gets to see God inviting us to start over. Some of you are here this morning and you lean into the compassion and the slow to anger and the graciousness and the faithfulness of God, and you need that. And yet there is this part of you that says, but I've got some stuff I got to pay for. I got some mistakes I've made. I've got some failures I've done, and I think I've got to figure that out first. That's not the case. This is your invitation from God to have a fresh start. So if you're here this morning and you say, you know what, this is all new to me. I want to have a fresh start with God. Well, then I would encourage you to come and talk to me afterwards. I'll be hanging around up here. Let today be your new beginning. Let today be the day where you get to take communion, get to enjoy this grace meal, get to celebrate the faithfulness and the graciousness of God in your life. The opportunity to start over. The second thing I want us to take away with is that God's mercy is greater than our mistakes. I know that's a little cliche, but I think it's one that it's important for us to remember. We live in a society now that often relationships are sort of transactional, right? In order for someone to do something for you, you got to do something for them, right? That if I make a mistake or if I fail, then there's this internal part of me that says I got to make up for that failure and mistake before I can be back to where I was with that relationship or with that person. That doesn't matter to God. It really doesn't matter. His mercy is far greater than any mistake you could ever make. And if you want proof of that, then come and talk to me afterwards. I was talking to some members this morning about some of my past mistakes. And his mercy is greater. The last thing I want you all to leave with is that the cross and the table are the reminders of God's promise to us. That the bread and the cup, they are this reminder that through the person and the work, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, we get to inherit and receive thousands upon thousands upon thousands of God's grace and his mercy and his compassion and his love. And at the same time, it's a time for us to be able to come to the table and say, God, please forgive me for these things. Forgive me for my mistakes. Forgive me for my failures. Forgive me for my shortcomings. And you here, you are forgiven. You are loved. Because God didn't give up on you. Let's wrap up our time here in a word of prayer. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, We thank you for this day, and we thank you for your compassion and grace and mercy. We thank you for your patience, your faithfulness, and your love. We thank you that all those words that describe you are the words that came from your very mouth. We can trust them, we can believe them. God, thank you for also being a God that recognized the need for justice, and that you heard the cry of your Son on our behalf, and that we have received forgiveness. We have received the grace and the mercy poured out onto us. Thank you for the table, for the bread and the cup today, that reminder. Spirit, do your work in us today. As we respond in song, as we respond in taking the bread and the cup, may this nourishment restore us and renew us today. We pray this all in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and all God's people said, amen. So at this time, Kids Church is going to start making their way back in.